I want to visit my friend's website, bob.com. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my computer and send what's called a web request to bob.com. A web request, you can kind of think of this as a letter you're sending to bob.com. So the problem is, when my computer first tries to establish a connection with bob.com, my computer doesn't know where bob.com is. So what it's going to do first is a DNS lookup. That stands for Domain Name System Lookup. So first, it's going to send this web request, which is actually a request for the address of bob.com, the IP address. Because all domain names, which is like bob.com, google.com, example.com, etc., are all linked to what's called an IP address. An IP address is just a machine-readable format of a domain name. So my computer is going to send a request to my router. In this case, you can think of the router as like the post office. So my mail, my web request goes to the router, as do other people's mails. In this case, the other houses are other devices like phones, TVs, other computers, etc. So what the router will then do is send a request to my internet service provider's DNS servers. So what these servers will do a pretty complicated lookup, will perform a lookup to try to find bob.com's IP address. So once they find the IP address, they'll send that IP address back to the router, and then from the router, that information will come back to the computer. So now that my computer has the IP address, it can then send another request to the router, but this time it actually knows where the information is supposed to go. So it's going to send what's called a GET request. Basically, you can think of this as another letter that's asking bob.com for the content of bob.com. So the router is then going to send that over the World Wide Web to bob.com. So in between here, this is basically a bunch of my internet service provider's infrastructure. If bob.com is located overseas, then it has to go through a bunch of underseas cables, and then eventually it reaches bob.com's routers. Bob.com's router. So once it reaches this router, this information then gets forwarded to bob.com's server. So most of the servers that are used to actually store the content of a website are actually not that different from the computers you and I use most of the time. So once bob.com gets this content, it's then going to send that content back. You can kind of think of this like the content of bob.com is a reply to our original letter. And all of this stuff in between are kind of like big mail ships. I don't know if they actually had those, but I don't know. So it goes through bob.com's router over the World Wide Web back to our router, and then over here to our computer. Now, you may be asking, well, if I have my phone on this network and the TV on this network, but all of this information is going through the router, how does the router know whether the content is for the computer, the phone, the TV, or any of the devices on the network? So, for this, routers use something called network address translation. So this is a way for routers to map multiple different devices on its private network to the public network. So for people with regular networks like you and me, our router only has one public IP address. So this public IP address is shared by all of our devices. Now, the public part of public IP address means that when Bob.com gets this request, it shows that it's been sent from this public IP address. So Bob.com doesn't know the IP address of the phone or the TV or the computer. So what network address translation does is it basically creates a table. So this table has the private port and the public port. So when my computer sends a request through the router will request will come in through a port on the private network. Let's say 5435. So now, in order for the router to differentiate that from the phone's private port, let's say, 6235, and the TV's port, 5127, it then has to assign each of these a public port. So maybe it'll assign my computer the port 12390. So now when Bob.com sends the request back to the router, it will send it on port 12390. And then the router knows, okay, 12390 on the public port is mapped to port 5435 on the private port, which is this computer, which then allows it to finish this entire thing and give my computer the content of Bob.com.